So thank you very much, all of you, to be there in the panel Financing the Triple Crisis when Costs Are an Investment. As we know, the global economy is currently facing three crises, or more, maybe we have been discussing about that, which threaten to undermine the welfare and prosperity of present and future generations. The first is the climate change. So the growing carbon emissions continue unchecked, and rise in temperature and sea level are exceeding previous estimates. The second is the loss of biodiversity, and the third is the well-known increasing level of pollution. Today, many low-income countries and some middle-income countries too are having to make deeply painful choices between, for example, repaying debt and spending money on health and education, between investing in nature and developing their natural resources. The tension between fiscal sustainability and environmental sustainability has never been greater. And those countries are facing a triple crisis. The economic and social impact of climate change are becoming more frequent and more severe. The loss of nature and biodiversity are approaching dangerous tipping points, and their debt burdens are increasing, exacerbating by increasing interest rate in advanced economy over the last 2 years. These crises are reinforcing one another in alarming vicious circle. The high cost of serving debt leaves little, if any, fiscal space for spending on climate adaptation and nature conservation. There is a way out of this trap. Shifting to a more climate resilient, lower carbon and nature positive growth path can offer many countries a route to economic growth, job creation and environmental sustainability, thereby reducing future risk and in principle lowering the cost of debt. This virtuous circle, however, requires strong domestic policies, a stable investment climate, more robust domestic resources mobilization, sound debt management, and the right environmental incentive. Indeed, strong domestic institutions are the cornerstone of economic success. Moving toward the virtuous circle also necessitates an evolution in the global financial system. The cost of capital in low and middle income countries is too high to allow for investment in stabilizing climate and nature while also addressing pressing social needs. International financial institutions need to work toward reducing effective borrowing costs. So this panel is going to discuss about this, in particular strategies to finance climate change mitigation and adaptation policy, as well as biodiversity conservation policy in a scenario of urgency to achieve the 3030 goals. And to start, we are going to give the floor to Ramon Pich Madruga. Ramon, where are you? You are here, there. So Ramon serves as vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He has been director of the Center for World Economic Studies in Cuba since 2013. He is also an associate professor of the Faculty of Economics at the University of Havana. Moreover, he has been a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Inter-American Institute for Research on Global Change from 2007 to 2013, and a member of the Academy of Science of Cuba since 2012. He has a degree in foreign trade economics from the University of Havana, a master's in social science from the University of Lund in Sweden, and a PhD in economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Ramon, thank you very much to be here. We give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and also thanks to the organizer for this event dealing with one of the more, let's say, relevant topics in terms of negotiations and also in terms of research dealing with environment in the current context that, as you mentioned, is a context of growing environmental challenges as has been widely recognized. Even the more recent surveys like the one done by the World Economic Forum, in which half of the 10 main global risks for the next 10 years correspond to environmental concerns, environmental problems, including the effect of climate change, reinforcing climate change, and also biodiversity loss and pollution. With regard to climate finance, I would say that climate finance in general, environmental finance, including climate finance, and technology issues, science, technology, and innovation are two of the crucial topics of the negotiations, international negotiations dealing with environment. within the context of the means of implementation. And this is even this conference, as we will know, are associated to this climatic issue as one of the core aspect, the core issues. And in the IPCC context, when assessing climate finance, the IPCC include or assess this concept finance in a very broad sense, and include both public and private, but also local, national, or international, bilateral, or multilateral, and alternative sources. And it takes the form of grants, technical assistance, loans, concessional or non-concessional, bonds, equity, risk insurance, and financial guarantees, of different types. So it's a very broad concept of finance. As I said before, finance, technology, and international cooperation are considered within the IPCC assessment as key enablers of climate action. And also another message from the last cycle of the IPCC is that public finance is an important enabler of adaptation and mitigation, and can also leverage private finance. In general, with regard to the need of closing investment gaps dealing with finance, it was also highlighted in the context of the IPCC assessment that current financial flows are significantly lower than the levels needed by 2030 to limit warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. This is one message. The second one is that there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close investment gaps, but there are barriers to redirect, to orient capital to climate actions. Another finding, another message, is related to the challenge of closing gaps. That the challenge of closing gaps is widest for developing countries, and in that sense, it is mentioned the context of indebtedness, foreign direct indebtedness facing developing countries. You also refer to that when making the presentation of this report. According to some international statistics by the International Monetary Fund, for instance, the so-called emerging economy and the developing countries have a foreign debt around 12 trillion US dollars. So it's really huge. This is a very aggregated figure, but it's just as a reference for you to take into account. And then there are messages associated both to financing adaptation and financing mitigation. With regard to financing adaptation, there are two key messages out of the report of the IPCC. At least I choose these two. One has to do with the fact that current global financial flows for adaptation are insufficient for and constrain the implementation of adaptation options, especially in the developing countries. And second, a small proportion of global tracked financial climate finance was targeted to adaptation. A very small proportion of this global track finance, climate finance was targeted to adaptation, and an overwhelming majority to mitigation. Then, with regard to financing mitigation, there are at least four ideas here that I would like to highlight. First is that finance flows fall short of the level needed to meet climate goals across all sectors and regions. Second, public and private finance flows for fossil fuels are still greater than those for climate adaptation and mitigation. Third, that in fact the overwhelming majority of tracked climate finance is directed towards mitigation, but even though falls short of the level needed to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius across all sectors and regions. And there is also a mention which is closely associated to the topic of this COP29, that is the figures that in the year 2018, public and publicly mobilized private climate finance flows from developed to developing countries were below the collective goal under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 in the context of meaningful mitigation action and transparency on implementation. So these are some of the topics I wanted to highlight. As I said before, the insufficiency in general, both with regard to mitigation, adaptation. Secondly, the lack of balance between the finance for adaptation and mitigation, and also the growing concern with regard to barriers and difficulties, restrictions of the developing countries in the context characterized by this indebtedness and other restrictions. So with this, I would like to close this first presentation, and later we can come back on much more elaboration on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramon, to give us the picture of the voice of the EPCC concerning those topics, and obviously we're going to come back to this in a few minutes. Now I'm going to give the floor to Jerry Sinderman through Zoom. Jerry is the Executive Director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance and the President of the Green FinTech Network. As an Executive Director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance, Jerry leads the Swiss-based solution, its key initiative, and oversees GDFA thematic program and project portfolio, especially focused on digital and data-driven financial and business model innovations for sustainable cities and the blue economy. Jerrit is co-founder and president of the Green FinTech Network, a multi-stakeholders association building a thriving green digital finance ecosystem in Switzerland in collaboration with leaders from financial industry and academia, as well as supported by the Swiss Finance Ministry. Earlier, Jerrit led an incubator and accelerator for the financial service industry, where he also served as a board member of the investment arm, and Jerrit worked as a banker for 10 years, mostly with ABN AMRO Bank, until he became an entrepreneur in 2010 and co-founded, led and worked with mostly fintech startup over 12 years. Jerrit, we are very happy to have you here. Can you hear us? I can see you.
Yes, thank you very much, Patricia, and hi everyone. And I also realized I should have shortened the bio as an introduction, as we have more important things to talk today about. So let me share my screen. I've brought a small presentation, and please let me know whether you can see it then. One sec. And you should see my presentation now.
Presentation, yes.
Okay, we'll just go into screen sharing or into presentation mode. Good. Okay, so as Patricia already introduced, so we are a Swiss foundation, and we are looking especially at the different angles in which the financial industry can be enabled to take an agent role, a change agent role for climate and nature. And especially when we are now looking at the oceans, and I mean, forgive me that my presentation is not fully targeted at the angle that maybe the other representatives are taking.
Yeah, it is not.
Yes, sure.
It is not in presentation mode. Could you switch?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Let me share. So, are you now seeing in presentation mode?
Not yet.
No, we are seeing you.
Ah, okay. No?
Can you put full screen, maybe? Is it possible somewhere? To have a
Yes. Yeah, I'm actually switching screens now, but I'm just watching switching in the wrong direction. Strange. Let me.
Okay, no. I think no
Otherwise
problem. Go ahead with that.
Yeah, let me. Otherwise, I'm sharing just simply this screen, and I will enlarge it as much as possible.
like this, it's better actually. Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry for this. Yes, so I mean, as we're speaking about maritime or marine ecosystems, I think one important thing from our perspective is not to forget that anything that happens on the ocean doesn't happen without someone financing or funding it or investing in it. And that brought us, as part of our Making Oceans Count program that we are working on together with our partners at HarborOcean and Copenhagen Business School, and funded also by Velux Foundation, to the question, and it's probably like one of the many trillion-dollar questions: how could we make ocean biodiversity a key decision factor for investors? And a few underlying rationales led our research on this. One was that investment activity, also for the blue economy, is often very much driven and influenced by regulation. There are already like an increasing number of regulations and standards that are increasing the pressure to disclose on nature across industries. And at the same time, compared to carbon and climate, biodiversity is infinitely more complex. And that is also putting a financial institution at their challenge. So there's a big need for actionable data and metrics. And this is the core of the current work. We focused on a sector-specific research first. So started with shipping, soon we'll go also into offshore wind, and to explore how these have an impact on maritime protected areas or maritime sensitive areas. And in the context also of last year's COP15, when the global biodiversity framework was introduced, there is, I think, now a big recognition that what gets measured gets managed. At least there's a bigger chance for it to get managed, as we now know. But there was like a big reference also at disclosures. And when we're looking now at disclosures, and in this case, when it touches the ocean and marine ecosystems, we're speaking, or we're calling it blue metrics and assessments. We have to look at different perspectives if you want to do meaningful work. One is, of course, the framework setting, the regulation and the standard setters on top. However, anything that shall be disclosed in a uniform way and also in a meaningful way will need to be collected and made available by data providers on the left side. And of course, industry needs to be able to work with it to make decisions on it. So whether it's the physical blue economy industry or whether it's the financial sector. However, there's now many sources and angles from which you can look at the data that you disclose on marine ecosystems and related human activity. Whether you go on a financial or corporate perspective, whether you go on a blue industry specific way to cut it, or there's also the many environmental standards from which you would need to report to make it really impactful. And to complex the matters, financial industry is probably also one of the hardest regulated ones. So it's also subjected to a lot of like financial industry specific, product specific regulation. Of course, has to comply. And I mean, here we're emphasizing, because of the starting point of our research, more the European part, where a lot of things are already like quite heavily regulated. However, there's of course also the global standards, and so the alignment between all these standards and frameworks is putting a lot of challenges out there. However, at least we have recognized that across those standards and frameworks, there is already an increasing requirement, at least for granular reporting and monitoring. We see also that what's quite important for the ecosystems and biodiversity, location-specific metrics are more and more requested, and also there's a broad acceptance that it's much more important to also focus on the sensitive zones. It's also compared to some other climate-related topics and international standards. The double materiality is already broadly accepted. Here it's much about also covering the impact side, not only the risk side for the industry sectors. However, we also saw that there's still a lack of consistency of language and of definitions, and often methodologies are not really defined, which makes it very hard if you're in a very data-driven, a very strongly regulated industry. And just to give you a short example, so for example, the mentioning of sensitive zones has very different language across the different frameworks and regulatory standards. So whether you speak of biodiversity sensitive zones under the CSRD and SFRD, under TNFD, it's ecologically sensitive areas, or in the IMO, it's particularly sensitive sea areas. So it makes it very hard to identify whether you're compliant with a framework or not, and how to harmonize your reporting across them. We see on the other side, and that's, sorry? Okay. We see on the other side that there's also already like an increasing broader interest of investors and financial institutions. So now it's not only about compliance anymore, but it's also about target setting. And even there's a growing interest in identifying opportunities that come from the transition that has been initiated. So that's very encouraging. However, we also see that only 30% of the investors so far have gotten their head around a first level assessment of ocean-related activity. And to make things complete, or the complexity, it's also when you look at how to enable industry change via data, the level of granularity is very different, and the type of data that you need, whether you want to manage a global portfolio of, let's say, a mutual fund, or whether you're investing in a specific conservation project in a local context. And the same also from the value chain perspective. Are you already talking about the end product, or are you talking somewhere up in the value chain? And so while we are trying to increase, or while regulators and all invested stakeholders are already working heavily on increasing transparency, there's definitely a clear need for also reducing complexity if anything shall happen, and also financial flows that are urgently needed shall be redirected. And it's also not about only data, because data we have sufficient, or on many topics, but it's also about actionable insights to trigger exactly this decision-making, and to connect all the dots between the different elements that we have for healthy oceans, whether it's from the species and the endangered species, whether it's about whole marine ecosystems, individual sectoral activity, or also all the stakeholders that are actually investing and funding and owning those activities. So just to close off, and to also maybe stimulate a few thoughts about it. So what we are also doing in this project is to overlay all this information. So information about the sensitive areas, the economic activity. So for example, here you see the blue line is a cruise ship, how it's cruising across the Atlantic and then into the Caribbean. This is also more a visualization, because in the end, humans need to interact with the data, and therefore we see a strong need of this becoming not only interpreted but also easily accessible. And we are very happy for anyone who's interested in this type of work and to contribute to engage with us. So thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tarik. It's certainly a very interesting work that you have done. I have a lot of questions. We have tried from Philanthropico Testolari to promote this kind of exercise in North Patagonia with a system to certify the captured carbon and then introduce that to the market in order to create a kind of public market. But it was very complicated because, well, the whales doesn't belong to anyone, and they eventually go somewhere else and so on. So, well, thank you for your intervention. Now we are going to give, let me find again we are going to give the floor to Valerie Hickey. I just want to know, Eric Wandrag, are you here or not? No, he's not here. So yes, let's continue with Valerie Hickey. Valerie is the Global Director, Environmental Department of the World Bank. Prior to that, she was a manager for advisor and operation in the Climate Change Group, where she oversees the implementation of the World Bank's commitment on climate change, climate mainstream, and climate finance. And before that, the practice manager for ENB in Latin America and the Caribbean, where she managed a cross-sectoral team that support countries and community on issues related to the climate change, sustainable forest management, integrate conservation and development, integrate coastal management, fisheries, pollution management, and environmental health, environmental economics, and environmental risk management. Valerie, we are a fan of you. So thank you very much to be here.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm a fan of yours and everything that Cortes Solari is doing, and Fund and Velux and everybody else. You know, it's interesting to be here at this stage of the COP talking about finance, because the truth is there's a terrible clash of crises that is happening at exactly the worst time for the most vulnerable countries and most vulnerable communities. Because yes, we have the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the pollution crisis, the crisis that all of us who work in the environmental space talk about all the time. But we also have a financial crisis, whether it's in terms of indebtedness everywhere, not just in the global south, but in the global north too, whether it's in the case of a cost of living crisis, an affordability crisis. So there's a whole financial set of crises that are also happening. There's also an education crisis after COVID. 70% of 10-year-olds in the global south are functionally illiterate. They can't read or write. 70%. Somebody's got to pay for that. There's a food security crisis. 750 million people don't know where their next meal is coming from. 49 million people today in 2024 are starving. So unfortunately, we live in a world where it isn't just the climate crisis. There are a clash of crises, all of which are crying out for money, all of which need more money. But unfortunately, one of the struggles we have in trying to navigate this clash of crises, I think, is, unfortunately, severe financial illiteracy. Most of us, I'm a trained conservation biologist. I'm a malacologist. I did my PhD on snails, right? I had to learn finance the hard way, like most of us did, by making huge mistakes. But too often we talk about finance without understanding it. We talk about economics without understanding it, and all of that's doing is destroying trust. When we use terms, and Ramon, you're right, there is insufficient funding, but every time we say insufficient, there's this sense that someone somewhere has a big pot of money and they're just too mean to share it. And that's not the reality. There just isn't enough money anywhere. And expectations have been raised, and there are a clash of crises, all of which are crying out for money. And of course, it's all the same communities. The communities in Sindh province, where in Pakistan, where 2 million people lost their homes, are exactly the same people who are seeing their land degraded, so their food security worse. They're people who also, their kids haven't been able to go to school, so they're part of that 7 out of 10 kids who can't read or write. So it's all the same communities, and that's why we need a little bit to get back to basics when it comes to finance. And we spend a lot of time talking about the quantity of finance, and that's okay, but let's get back to basics. The first basic truth is that most money for all of these crises has to come from domestic public budgets. It's not going to come from another country. It's not going to come from foundations. It's coming from domestic public budgets. And that's why we can't have these conversations without talking about subsidy reform. Every year, countries spend $1.5 trillion, on energy, agriculture, and fisheries subsidies. That's money most countries don't have to spend. What's worse is they're spending it and causing an additional $5.5 trillion worth of damage every year. That's not good math. If you're spending money to simply dig yourself a deeper hole, whether it's in education or food security or any of the Rio Trio crises. And so we have to talk about subsidy reform, because that's the money governments are already spending. So the money is there, they just need to spend it on building up the world and building resilience to those communities on the forefront of all of these crises, rather than undermining their resilience. You can still give the same amount of money to the same small farmers, but instead of giving them money to spend on nitrogen fertilizer, and they're spending it, they're putting 10%, they're being incentivized to put 10% more agricultural nitrogen fertilizer on their land, and it's only leading to a 2% increase in on-farm productivity. but they're getting almost 4% sicker. Their kids are getting sicker because that nitrogen fertilizer is aerosolizing into the air, it's going into the water, and it's poisoning them. So why not give them the same amount of money, because they need the money, they're small farmers, but give it to them for biofertilizer. Give it to them to manage trees on farm so that they get better productivity without the healthcare downside. So these are the kind of discussions we have to have about subsidy reform, because that's $1.5 trillion that can be used of, instead of accelerating all of these crises, it can actually be used to solve them. Then, of course, we all talk about the private sector, and it's important, but we forget that the private sector is in the business of making money. And that's okay. Profit is not a bad thing. But the private sector responds to two things. They want to maximize profit within two realities. They live between a rock and a hard place. The rock is government regulation, and the hard place is consumer demand, the market. And so we need to make sure that governments are putting in place the regulation that allows businesses, not just big business, but micro and small business, to still make a profit, to still be competitive in the marketplace, but to do it in a way that helps solve these crises, not make them worse. And the market has to do the same thing. Consumers have to start demanding access to products that are healthy, that are decarbonized, that are nature positive, without us expecting people to pay a premium, because most people are struggling to pay their everyday bills at the grocery store. We can't ask them to pay more for food when they're already hungry. So we need government regulation and the market to be sensitive to allow the private sector to continue to make profit, because that's how we get jobs, that's how we get investment, but to do in a way that solves all of these crises, not makes them worse. And then finally, there's the pot of money that at COPs we spend all our time talking about, but it is the tiniest pot of money, which is international public finance flows. The money from MDBs, the money from overseas development assistance, it's a tiny pot of money. Because again, even though all of the MDBs, we have committed at this COP to invest $120 billion a year starting in 2025 on climate action, remember the numbers. That's less than 10% of just the subsidy spend every year. So it's a tiny pot of money, and that money has to be used more strategically. It has to be used no longer just to finance green projects, it has to be used to build green economies. That means it has to start paying for the policy reform and the institution building, so the private sector has a good business partner to work with in the government. But that partner will force the private sector to do better. We have to have the right regulation in place to attract investment. It also is the international public finance that has to absorb the cost of innovation. We should not be asking small companies in emerging markets or poor communities in the developing country to try something new and to spend scarce resources on trying something new. They should not have to spend their money on innovation. Innovation should be paid for by the international community. And absorbing that risk of failure should be on us, not on the communities and the small companies at the forefront of these crises. And of course, our money has to be used to de-risk for the private sector. Basically, that means to make sure that where technologies are not yet providing commercial rates of return, international public money can de-risk to make the difference, so companies will continue to invest. It also means de-risking so that private sector will spend in countries where the rates of return are not as high and the rates of risk are too high. It's a sweetener to bring companies back to the Africa continent where they have been fleeing the last decade. And that's how we have to cleverly use the pots of international money. They're small, but they can be catalytic. But that's about going back to basics on the quantity of money, and that's really where we have to do so that we can rebuild the trust by all having a shared conversation based on a shared understanding of the reality of how money makes the world go round. In another date, we're going to have to talk about the quality of money. We're going to have to talk about access and impact, but that's not for this discussion. But my final plea is we all need to take responsibility for becoming a little bit more financially literate, understanding that there is nobody sitting with a big pot of money who's simply being too selfish to share, and understanding that there are so many crises that we have to start using money more smartly and using the different pots of money for what they're intended to do, because that's how we end up, instead of having a clash of crises, we can begin to attack these crises and solve them all at once. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Valerie. You are brave, and I love your words. It's making me a lot of sense, and also I was thinking, I was writing a lobby, what happens in the middle income countries, where we know that if countries try to make such a decision to give less subsidies, they have a lot of pressure from the private sector. We know about that. So we probably are going to discuss that in a few minutes with Manuel, because obviously this is something that is completely applicable to our countries. So Manuel, very welcome. Manuel is the Climate Crisis Commission Chair of the USN, or USN. He previously served as Minister of the Environment of Peru between 2011 and 2016, and as President of the 20th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP29, in 2014. He has been recognized for his contribution to the Paris Agreement by the governments of France, Germany, and Spain, and he's currently also the global leader of climate and energy at the USN member organization, WWF. Bienvenido, Manuel. I give you the floor.
Gracias, Patricia. And thank you for being here, and thank you, Valerie, thank you, Ramon, for your remarks. So I will build my reflections based on what Valerie has just said, because this is about on financing the triple crisis. And sometimes we do think that it is as simple as to put a bucket in front of us to receive some coins and some tiny currency, but it is not that. It is to be prepared. It is to strengthen our capacities to really get the money that it must be mobilized to address the triple crisis. So that is why I will try to share with you how to navigate towards a successful outcome that can make us able to get those resources for the triple crisis. I have 6 points. I will be short because at noon exactly I have to run, and sorry for that, Patricia. So yeah, let me start. So we are talking about the triple crisis. That means that we have to think on synergies, because in 1992 we adopted different agreement or conventions, the climate, the biodiversity, and then the desertification. And in Riyadh, because of the desertification, what we can see it is that there is like a more willingness to talk about synergies. That for sure doesn't mean that we will merge conventions. That would be a mistake. What we will see it is how to connect those conventions, how to put those conventions talk each to other, how to put the science panels, IPCC and IPBES, working more closer in, for example, suggesting to decision makers what are those transitions that we have to walk to address that triple crisis. So there is a political process. That political process, it is moving us towards synergies, and that is the first thing. We have to identify exactly what is happening in the political process. But second, as I've already mentioned, what are those connectors? Where exactly can we connect to address the triple crisis? It could be in the global arena, but probably mostly in the domestic arena. Cali COP16 has already said we have to put more closer the climate and biodiversity plans. So what we do need it is to promote an internal dialogue that can make us able to not only develop but implement our NDC, that it is a climate plan, plus the long-term strategy, plus the national adaptation plan, with the national biodiversity and ecosystem services plan, the MBSAPs. Because when it is about the planning process, what we do need it is to connect as a way to be more effective in the outcome and more efficient in the use of resources, and even more coherent with our own governance structure to achieve and to implement those objectives. So there is one connector there, but it is not a single one. Also, there is a connector because of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions, it is an instrument that it is evolving. In UNEA 5 in 2022, we got a good recognition by government on a clear definition, but also on how nature-based solutions must evolve. And we have to consider that nature-based solutions, it is an instrument that can help us to address this societal challenge: climate and mitigation and adaptation, health, food security, water security, and disaster risk reduction. So MBS also, it is an instrument that could help us to connect when it is about the triple crisis. But also there are some other connectors. The action agenda. You know that it was in Lima, and I feel so proud that we did that in Lima. It was the first time ever in which we convened the non-state actors into the table, and we started this dynamic called the action agenda. In the beginning, it used to be called the Lima-Paris Action Agenda, and then evolved, the name shift into the Marrakesh Partnership. And we did that by knowing that the only way to implement it is by bringing all the actors into the same table to discuss each to other. Fortunately, that is happening in a more modest way in the CBD. In Riyadh, an action agenda for the certification convention, it will be launched, and even the plastics treaty will include an action agenda for the plastic treaty itself. So to make those agendas to talk each to other, it is also something that it could be very useful. But also in his reflections, our colleague Gerrit, it was Gerrit, yes, Gerrit, talk about on metrics and standards, because also to connect, what we do need to have, it is a clear benchmarking. We do need to develop metrics. We do need to continue building upon what does it mean net zero, nature positive, what does it mean all those concepts that are in our common jargon, but that deserve more content, more standard, more validation system, because it is a way in which we will connect those objectives to address the triple crisis. But also that moves me to something that Valerie has just mentioned. When it is about finance, it is about the public finance, and here we are discussing the NCQG, and we know what does it mean for me, and I hope we can get something by the end of this COP. The NCQG, it is something that it is going beyond the quantum. In Paris, we had a quantum, 100 billions. It was so difficult to achieve it, but finally it has been confirmed in 2022. But now we are discussing a package, that it is a quantum plus. No, G77, it is talking about 1.3 trillion, plus, no, have very accessible conditions to allow the most vulnerable in the developing world to access to those resources, include transparency mechanism or principles, have ways to tracking progress, among some others. That is the NCQG, and that is happening here. But friends, there are many other ways to mobilize resources by a clear public mechanism. Carbon pricing and carbon taxes, it is something that we have to continue working on, including the emissions trade system, the ETS. Taxonomies, something that it is happening in many places of the world, mostly in Europe. Now I have already read a very good, not report, it is, a report talking about taxonomy for adaptation. Fantastic. No, we used to think just on taxonomy for mitigation. Now there are taxonomies for adaptation. Green bonds. I am the chair of an evaluation council of the French sovereign green bonds, and it is so effective because the purpose it is to use those resources to promote actions in biodiversity, climate, and pollution. No, so has shown to be very effective in connecting that triple crisis among many other public mechanisms. And Valerie has already mentioned what does it mean to work with the private sector. No, we have to connect with them. We have to understand what Valerie mentioned, that it is, they are expecting for regulation, and they move their things because of consumers and markets. So the point it is, how can we use those mechanisms to make the private sector to be more willing to bring resources to, for example, conservation efforts, because conservation has been mostly financed because of philanthropy. But how can we promote investment to conservation? How can we do to bring investment to achieve the 30-for-30? That is the goal. That is in what we have to work on, in be prepared to promote those investments into our 30-for-30 nation positive net zero objective. But for that, we do need to convene that private sector. That moves me to something that it is so important. We have to develop the economic case for the NDCs, because unfortunately it is not happening. In many countries, the NDC, it is a very low relevant document in charge of a very tiny ministry, and I used to be a minister of that tiny, and that is why I know how tiny it can be, that it is the Ministry of the Environment. When probably it must, not probably, when it must be part of the Ministry of Finance, it must be part of a strong public policy, it must be part of what many countries are looking for, competitiveness. That concept, I am sure Valerie fully agree. Competitiveness, it is that word that we have to use when it is about on promoting mechanism to attract investment or attract more money. And I am losing my ideas. I am in the 5 or the 4, I don't know. Okay, so it is important to consider those kinds of plans when it is about the economic case. And look, in climate, we have been already able to, in some way, develop the economic case for climate because of the transition suggested by science, the IPCC, that is clear. Also because of the ability of the action agenda to organize sectors. No, so it is clear that when we are talking about climate, there is an economic dynamic that it is feeding back the process, what it is good. Is that happening with nature? Not yet. We have to develop the economic case for nature. We do need to know what are those transforming sectors that would make us able to achieve nature objective. And I know that the IPBES is working on that, no? In those transforming sectors. Because there are many ways to address those transformations for the nature side. It could be by sectors that are depending a lot on natural resources. It could be by sectors that are affecting natural resources. So there are many, many options. We have to have clarity on how to walk those transitions, because that could make us more able to financing that triple crisis. Then when it is about on money for what, I can immediately think on it could be for developing policies. We do need to strengthen those policies, and that needs some resources to be strengthened. Sometimes that policies includes governance structure. I am fully convinced that in Latin America it is time to change this Ministry of the Environment and to bring this idea of ecological transition to connect with climate, to connect with energy as in Costa Rica, no? Because the Ministry of the Environment are probably a bit missed when it is about this economic discussion. It could be money to enable the conditions, or it could be money to implement on the ground, no? And for sure, the three options are fully valid, but we do need to be clear so for what we are demanding or requesting that amount of money. And that moves me to the last, because I am taking too much time, that it is something that Valerie has already mentioned. We have a lot of available instruments when it is about finance. We have the fiscal system. In many countries, we are not using the fiscal system to incentivize some conduct. Unfortunately, in some cases, we are doing exactly the same. Exactly the opposite. No, we are putting more incentive to continue using diesel than to promote electric vehicles. It's fully absurd. I am fully upset with my country that it has already received 2 days ago, because of APEC, I don't know how many trains, how many wagons from diesel from California. So that is, so stupid. No, when we are in the, when we must be in the opposite. No, what we do need in Peru, it is to promote electrification of the transport and not to receive all technology, no, that it is burning diesel. So those are the kind of things that we have to avoid by using well the fiscal policy. but also it is around debts. And look, friends, debts, it is something in which we have already developed a lot of experience. Debt swaps, it has been used in the world for conservation since the 80s or 90s, probably 90s. Yeah, yeah. The 80s. I remember debt swaps in Peru, in Ecuador. The first one, it was in Ecuador. Now we are having a debt swap for Ecuador for Galapagos, a new one. So we are always thinking that we are starting from scratch. No, that is not true. We have developed a lot of experience. So debt, it is something so important. Valerie mentioned subsidies, the harmful subsidies. I know how difficult is that because also that is related to WTO and the resistance in the WTO to address that. But we have to insist. We have to insist in using subsidies as a mechanism to promote, not as a mechanism to continue in a business as usual way. What else? You mentioned some numbers, and let me bring to you a number that I heard a couple of days ago. The profit from the oil sector since 1970 until now, it has been around $2 billion a day. $2 billion a day. Can you imagine if we had put a 8%, 6% tax to those profits? No, we should have not, we would have not been in the current situation that we are facing because of climate extreme event. So also, to see how can we use the system to put a tax to those activities that are burning fossil fuels, how can we use the system to shift and to promote the transition, it is something so important. So my last reflection, my last message, it is, let's be prepared. Sometimes we are just asking for more money, and more money, but we are not doing our own task, our own homework. No, we do need to be prepared and to navigate all of these elements because that will be the only way in which we can get the benefits of the resource mobilization to address the triple crisis. So let's move our action from the policy in the global arena into the implementation in the domestic one. Let's promote more dialogue in between multilateral development banks, ministers of finance. And sorry, by the way, how many of you know what is the current situation with the coalition of ministers of finance for climate? I think that is the name, that it was created in 2008, I think so, or 09 in a spring meeting in the World Bank and with the IMF, and that it has, I think that for now, 100 Minister of Finance discussing about climate. That is what we have to point. That is what we have to be, sitting with them and saying, look, friends, you have this coalition based on what it is called the Helsinki Principle, the Santiago Action Plan. Let's move this forward. So hope that this can help to navigate well how to financing the triple crisis. And with that, apologies, Valerie, apologies, Ramon, I have to run to the next. And thank you, Patricia.
Run, Manuel. Muchas gracias. Realmente fantástico. Thank you very much for all your intervention, please. And first of all, I have a lot of questions, but before that, I wish to open the floor to the public. I don't know if you have a comments or question for our guests. Otherwise, I can start. Well, Ramon, Jared, and Valerie, you mentioned public sector. We will talk about the private sectors. And I was thinking, I have different questions, but I was thinking, first of all, in the need of governance and legal certainty. When we talk about the need of investment from the private sectors in the middle, at least middle-income countries in South America, one of the main difficulties is legal certainty. And it's difficult everything around the potential valuation of ecosystem services. And this is the other question, let's say. We need, as an economist, and really we have been trying to help the national government to do so. We have a lot of exercise in the CLAC, the CEPAL, la Comisión Económica de América Latina y el Caribe, in that direction in order to try to evaluate the marine ecosystem services and put a price on the damage. So I wish to have your comments on that because we really believe that that could be a way to have those funds and promote at the same time the investment on the private sector.
No, thank you, Patricia. You know, what's fascinating is we, as a community, have been talking about valuation of ecosystem services for 40 years. And we finally have something called the UN System of Environmental and Economic Accounts, which is putting forward very concrete methodologies for assessing renewable natural capital accounts, including ecosystem services, that are assessed in a way that fits within a Ministry of Finance system of national accounts. Because it's what Manuel was saying, is that we need to stop just talking to ministries of environment. We need to get nature and climate and pollution into the Ministry of Finance. And to do that, we need to speak their language, not expect them to learn ours. And so every Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning or Economy, whatever they're called in every country, has a system of national accounts against which they adjudicate growth and the policy impacts on growth. And for a long time, those system of national accounts ignored natural capital wealth. It ignored ecosystem services. Growth models would only take account of nature, for example, when it was dug up, cut down, or fished out. So it only turned up in the system of national accounts when that fish was taken out of the water and put on a boat, or when the tree was cut down. Those models are changing. They're now taking account of the fact that, yes, if you cut down a tree, maybe you'll get $5 for the tree, but you're going to lose $25 in your agricultural productivity, and you're going to lose $50 in your nature-based tourism. And so now those models are changing, and this, I think, has been an extraordinary important maturing of how we talk about ecosystem services, because we've moved from the discussion being around advocacy to really being around the action agenda, such that we're doing it in the language of ministries of finance within their decision-making framework, using their models, so they don't have to learn anything new to understand the implications we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you, Valerie, also for the intervention. I will say, as I said at the beginning, that this is a very controversial topic in the international debates, and of course also in the negotiation process, and it has to do with the different perspectives that are part of the whole issue, and it's part also of the literacy process that is needed indeed for going further in this regard. And the IPCC tried, as part of the mandate, to try to capture the whole range, or to the extent possible, the whole range of perspective with regard to these kind of issues, because at the end we are talking about environmental challenges, and environmental challenges are very specific in terms of the nature. In case of these triple elements of the crisis, I mean the climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and even land degradation. There are many aspects that have to do with the long-term nature of this problem, that in many cases imply that only with a short-term oriented kind of actions is not possible to solve or properly address this kind of issues. So this time scale is crucial when considering this, not always, let's say, business oriented to short-term profits and so on are the solution to many of those, even when talking about valuation of resources, because there are many impacts which are non-economics, and so how to deal with that? For sure, I agree that this change experience in terms of having much more comprehensive or much more advanced, let's say, calculation of this valuation, including not only the utilitarian direct effect, but also, as you mentioned before, this improvement in terms of the economic valuation. It has been an improvement indeed, but for sure there is still a lot of gaps in that sense due to the nature of the problem we are talking about, and this is very important to take this into account when talking about environmental issues. Also, I fully agree that this is these are global challenges, and as a global challenge require global efforts, with everybody being part of the problem, and also everybody being part of the solutions, but also taking into account the different situation in which the different countries are, and also the whole discussion with regard to the common but differentiated responsibility and equity, which is also in the base of all the many of the debates taking place in the convention. So as I said, it's really very controversial, this kind of issue, and this is at the same time crucial, because without financing and without even financing, because finance is crucial for financing technology. So financing is the core of the core in this discussion, and as I said, and the IPCC recognizing the assessment key enablers for climate action. So even when it is said that there is sufficient global capital, it doesn't mean that there is a bag of money to be distributed. It means that there are current uses of this money that probably could be three-dimensional, and this part of this money, you put the example of the subsidies. For sure, this could be, and in many cases, subsidies to fossil fuels. This could be part of the one of the tools. Our colleague from Peru also mentioned taxes as a possibility of a certain operation. But there could be other ways of redimension current use of the system money, and giving much more priority to environmental issues that in many cases could not be in the short term attractive for, let's say, private business, but and there, as I have been already said, it is the role of the public sector to also, work in the direction of making this money reoriented, or created the environment, enabling the environment for so doing. So these are many. It's a combination of many aspects, and some of them very polemic and very controversial. And this is the point.
I wanted to come back to that, and I'm going to give you the floor, because concerning the governance, I always have a feeling that this transition between a subsidiary model to promoting another kind of economical model needs to be with the help of private sector. In Chile, for example, you have a lot of subsidies on the salmon farm. And in the north of Patagonia, in bays and places where you should have no more than 5 farms, you have 13, 14, 20 farms, and it's a total disaster. But even the local community doesn't want them to live, because it's the only industry and the only company that give work. So obviously, to make a shift, we need the private sector. So that was the next question, but after that, I want to give you the floor.
Thank you for this session, and thank you for very enlightening information about financing. My name is Dr. Wilbur Otichilo. I come from Kenya. I was a member of parliament for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017. 2017 to date, I'm the governor of one of the regions in Kenya. The issue of subsidies is a very emotive issue, and it's an issue that as a government we have tried to see how best to remove subsidies, particularly on fossil products, and also to increase the eco tax, and the issue of even accounting for natural resources. But it's been quite a challenge, particularly in the developing countries. When you try to remove subsidies, the first thing, people go to the streets and they start demonstrating. And I want to give you an example. In Kenya, just last June, we came up with a finance bill where we said we must bring in eco tax for all the polluters, the vehicles, the companies that do all this. We put eco tax as part of the tax that should be done. We decided we want to move significantly subsidies on fuel. But I can tell you, we had demonstrations, NGOs mobilized everybody in the country, and we were brought to a standstill, and as a government, we had to withdraw the finance bill. And now, as I talk now, we still don't have a finance bill. So how do we move forward in this matter?
Yeah, I think that's the same question actually. How do we make that transition?
I think Dr. Wilbur is pointing to something that is so clear in all of these discussions, that all of the easy things have been done. Everything that's left involves trade-offs. Somebody's going to have to pay a bigger price, or they're going to have less of something. And that's what makes it so difficult. That's why at the World Bank, when we talk about subsidies, we talk about subsidy reform, not removal. Because it's not just a global South issue. It's not just something that's happening in Kenya. I'm Irish and I grew up on a farm, and we absolutely we're dependent on the subsidies that came from the European Union in order to be able to pay our bills. And any change in those subsidies sent all of our farmers out onto the street. So it's something that happens everywhere. And that's why we're increasingly talking about subsidy reform. How do we make sure that those same farmers, those same agricultural cooperatives and agricultural companies in a country like Kenya still get the same amount of money, but to do different things? I mean, Kenya is going through an extremely important process of land restoration and a very sophisticated thinking around how do you restore land, how do you do it in a way that helps with agroforestry and silvopastoral systems so that you have better water systems. And it's going to be a huge investment. And thinking through how do you subsidize small farmers to be part of that movement instead of simply subsidizing them to get more access to fertilizer. It's not easy. And that's why the issue of subsidiarity matters, making decision at the lowest level. It's governors, it's local councils that need to start making decisions about how do you use the same pot of money but redirect it. So it does become a very, very important but very difficult discussion. And it goes back to something that Manuel said, which is at the end of the day, the conversation matters, stakeholder engagement matters. I remember back in Chile, before the 2019 COP, I believe it was, when it was supposed to happen in Chile, there was a constitutional crisis exactly because the government suddenly put up the prices of the local metro fares in Santiago, a tiny increase in price, in order to pay for shifting the metro from being its energy source from a dirty source to a clean source. And because they hadn't spent a lot of time telling the community what they were doing or why there was a sudden increase, there were huge protests. The COP ended up having to be moved to Madrid. And so stakeholder engagement and communications are more important than ever. And we're very bad in the climate community at talking to people. The term nature-based solutions, we all use it. No one in my family knows what a nature-based solution is. They've never heard of that. It's a stupid term. But they know what it is to think about using hedgerows in order to improve pollination so that we get our potato crop is better. And so we need to be able to communicate to people. We need to be honest about the challenges that a government is facing and some of the options. So this stakeholder engagement, having everybody at the table and being honest about the challenges and having that sustained engagement. But the first way to solve any problem is to admit there is a problem. And we have a series of problems, none of which are easy to solve. And I have nothing but empathy for the men and women who are leading local government, state government, national governments who are trying to make these very difficult decisions. And also for the consumers for whom any new taxes get passed through to them, who are also having to make very difficult decisions about what they can buy any one day, how they put food on the table. And so we're in a difficult moment, and the first thing we have to do is admit that and then try and figure out how to get everyone around the table and create some solutions.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, in fact, some kind of instrument has been already mentioned. All of them has been already assessed by the IPCC, including taxes, including subsidy reforms and others that are assessed in the IPCC as part of the whole range of possibility. Of course, it doesn't mean that each tool, each instrument could be applied indistinctively in any kind of context. And the way in which it is used, it should be the same in the different contexts. The application of this tool is context specific. And even, I mean, the role of the IPCC is not to make recommendations in terms of one or the other specific tools. It provides the whole range of tools according to the existing literature, and then it's up to the stakeholders, the governments, and many others to consider each of them the advantages and disadvantages, but according to the specific context in which they are going to be applied, because the conditions are different. In fact, in the case of Chile, it was a very small increase, but however, it was probably in a context that it was the catalyzer for this kind of action. I mean, it's just to say that, because this is very context specific, the way in which you deal with this kind of instruments that could be diverse, but need to be properly associated to that context. If we are going to talk about this just transition and equity applied into this discussion. And secondly, what you said in terms of how to better communicate all this information in the context of the IPCC, communication is also crucial, and has been part of the objective to try to improve this kind of communication as much as possible, and all of these events are part of this. Thank you again, Patricia and the organizer, for the invitation, because it's crucial, this literacy process of going further in even in other activities that could contribute in terms of socializing this knowledge, and but with this orientation, trying to be comprehensive in terms of the different, to take care the different perspective with regard to these very complex issues that are environmental issues and need to be properly addressed and taken care of, taking into account the different conditions in different countries and regions and sectors.
Thank you very much, Valerie, Ramon, and Jared. It's really a pleasure to have you both here. It's an honor also. And thank you, everyone, to have listened to this panel. Jared is here. Jared, can you hear us? We can hear you, I hope.
Yes. Yes, I can. Hey. Thank you for having me.
Give you the floor.
Okay. Well, I think it was actually a late comment on some earlier points that Valerie had made about the ecosystem services and the natural capital accounting, and so I think that's a very necessary step to happen. But I think also, as Valerie mentioned earlier, industry has its own reality, and like to also enable to actually leverage and also engage industry. I think we also need to come up with ways how not only to put a cost on use of natural capital, but also to find ways across different industries, stakeholders, to share benefits. Let's say at the current state where nature is of course already quite deteriorated, we're basically having a new baseline, and if we were, for example, to think creatively, how can we overcome some industry resistance, and let's say there's like a local fishery that would strongly benefit in the midterm if ecosystems became more healthy, fish stocks would replenish, and you have some industries that are currently free to pollute, and you need to invest in urgently needed modernization and environmental technologies. If we were able to come up, for example, also with some creative funding or financing schemes where some of the future benefits that local fisheries would generate could be like pre-financed or could be pre-used to also co-fund and reduce basically the hurdle for other industries to invest in the urgently needed renovations. That could also help remove some of these, some of the resistance that industry has. Not saying that is a solution that is feeling like the most fair, but I think also in terms of a shortening time window and increasing urgency, we probably also need to look at such options. But that was more like a small side comment.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for this last comment. And again, thank you all of you. We are going to close this session and hope to see you soon, all of you. Thank you.